Brianna had been asleep when the phone rang, and the phone rang at 6:17 in the morning, which was not a time that phones rang in their apartment with good news. Good news arrived at reasonable hours, and bad news arrived at the edges of the day when the world was either not yet awake or just finishing being awake. And she knew before she fully surfaced from the sleep that something was wrong the way you knew things before you knew them. In the body before the mind, in the chest before the ears had finished processing the sound. She grabbed the phone from the nightstand, and the voice on the other end was a woman she knew slightly. One of the other staff from the Whitfield estate. A woman who worked the early morning shift and who had a voice that was trying to be measured and was not quite succeeding at it. And she asked if Evelyn was home, and Brianna said, "What in the woman said your mother? Is she home?" "She left here at the usual time, and nobody has been able to reach her, and I just wanted to check that she got in all right." Brianna sat up in the bed, and she looked across the small hallway to her mother's bedroom door, and the door was open the way it was open when the room was empty, and the bed was visible through the doorway, and the bed was made because her mother always made the bed before a shift, even though she was going to be sleeping in it again before many hours had passed. And the made bed and the open door, and the 6:17 on the phone, and the voice on the other end that was trying to be measured and was not quite succeeding combined in Brianna's chest into something that she did not have a word for, but that was cold and very specific and was already moving from feeling into action before she had made any conscious decision to act. She told the woman no, she was not home, and the woman said, "Oh," said it in a way you said, "Oh," when you had been hoping for the other answer, and the other answer had not come. And she said she was sure there was an explanation, and Brianna said yes, probably, and she ended the call, and she sat on the edge of her bed with her feet on the floor, and she looked at the made bed through the open door, and she tried to think. Her mother had worked the night shift at the Whitfield estate for 6 years. 6 years of leaving the apartment at 8:30 in the evening and arriving home at 6:20 or 6:25. Never later than 6:30. The consistency of it was one of the things Brianna had grown up organizing her own life around. The knowledge that her mother would be home before 7, that there would be a hand on her bedroom door and a quiet voice saying "I'm back" before she had to fully wake up. That the routine had a shape, and the shape held, and the holding of it was something she had taken for granted, in the way that you took for granted the things that had never once given you a reason not to. She called her mother's phone, and it rang 4 times, and went to voicemail, and her mother's voice on the voicemail was the practical, brisk voice she used for official things. Her name and a request to leave a message. And Brianna pressed end and called again, and it rang 4 times and went to voicemail again, and she pressed end, and she stood up, and she went to the kitchen, and she stood in the kitchen in the early morning dark, and she looked at the coffee cup on the drying rack, her mother's cup, washed and set to dry before the shift the way her mother always washed her cup before leaving, because she did not like to come home to unwashed things. And the cup on the rack, and the voicemail, and the open door, and the made bed were assembling themselves into a picture that Brianna's mind kept trying to find another interpretation for, and kept failing to find one. She called the neighbor, the one on the second floor, who had known her mother for 11 years, and who was the person they each called when the other one needed someone to think with. And the neighbor answered on the second ring in the alert way of someone who had not been deeply asleep. And Brianna told her, and the neighbor said, "Call the police." Said it without hesitation, and Brianna called the police. The officer who took the call was patient and thorough, and he asked the questions that the protocol required him to ask, and he took the information. And he said they would look into it, and they would be in contact, and he said the words about there being many possible explanations in the way that those words were always said, carefully and without committing to any particular implication. And Brianna listened to all of it, and she said thank you, and she ended the call, and she stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand, and she looked at the cup on the rack, and she understood in a way that was not dramatic but was completely certain that the protocol was not going to move fast enough, that the looking into it and the being in contact was operating on a timeline that was not the same as the timeline in her chest, which had no patience in it at all and was already past the point of waiting. Her mother was a woman who worked hard and came home on time and washed her cup before a shift and had never in 6 years given anyone at the Whitfield estate a reason to look for her. Evelyn Marsh was 51 years old, and she had raised Brianna alone from the time Brianna was 4 years old, and she had done it in the specific way of a woman who understood that the doing of it was not optional and had therefore approached the doing with everything she had, which was considerable, not in the financial sense, but in the sense of character and steadiness and the particular variety of love that expressed itself through consistency rather than declaration. Through the made bed and the wash cup and the hand on the bedroom door at 6:25 every morning for as long as Brianna could remember. She had worked the night shift for 6 years because the night shift paid slightly more than the day shift, and the slightly more had made a difference that was worth the cost of the hours. And she had built her life around those hours with the practical creativity of someone accustomed to making the available materials work for the life she needed to build. And the life she had built worked. It functioned, and it held, and it had given Brianna the foundation that Brianna was standing on right now in the kitchen at 6:30 in the morning, trying to figure out what to do. Brianna got dressed in the way of someone performing a necessary function rather than making choices. She put on the clothes that were closest, and she tied her shoes. And she grabbed her bag and her keys, and she went out the door, and she was halfway down the street before she had fully articulated to herself where she was going. But some part of her had known since the moment she sat up in the bed and looked at the open door and the made bed, had known that the only place that had information she did not have was the last place her mother had been. And the last place her mother had been was the Whitfield estate. And the Whitfield estate was 20 minutes away on foot and 12 minutes by the bus that ran every 15 minutes from the corner, and Brianna was at the corner in 4 minutes and at the estate gate in 14. And she stood at the gate in the February cold with her coat not properly done up, because she had not thought about her coat when she put it on. She had thought about the gate she was standing at now and the door beyond it and the bell she was going to ring and what she was going to say to whoever answered it, which was simply the truth, the plain and complete truth, because the truth was all she had and the truth was enough. Her mother had not come home after the night shift, and she needed someone to help her understand why. And she rang the bell once and then again, and then a third time, because the third time was already ringing before she had decided to ring it. And she stood in the February cold, and she waited for the door to open, and she did not allow herself to think beyond the door opening, because beyond that was too large to hold, and the door opening was the thing that was possible right now, and she concentrated on that, just that, the door and the opening of it and what she was going to say when it did. The door opened, and Harrison Whitfield was standing in it, and Brianna had prepared herself on the walk over and at the gate and in the 14 minutes on the bus for the various versions of who might answer that door and what the opening of it might look like and feel like, and whether she would be let in or managed from the threshold or redirected to a staff entrance or told to wait while someone went to find someone more appropriate to deal with whatever she was. But she had not prepared herself for this specific version, which was the man himself. The actual man whose name was on the buildings, and whose face she had seen in the newspaper photographs that her mother sometimes mentioned without emphasis, the way you mention the weather. Just information, just the context of where she spent her nights. And he was standing in his own doorway in the early morning in the clothes of someone who had been up for a while, but had not yet fully assembled the public version of himself. And he looked at her with the direct attention of someone whose mind was already working before he had said a word. And Brianna looked back at him, and she said what she had prepared to say. Said it in the voice she had been rehearsing in her chest for the past 20 minutes. And the voice came out steadier than she had expected it to. Steadier than she felt, which was its own small surprise. She said, "Sir," she said, "my name is Brianna, and my mother is Evelyn Marsh, and she works here, and she didn't come home after her shift last night, and nobody can reach her, and I need to know if anyone saw which way she went when she left." The words landed in the cold morning air. Between them and Harrison Whitfield stood in his doorway, and she watched him receive them in the specific way that people received information that was rearranging something in their understanding of the moment they were in. And then he did the thing she had not fully anticipated, which was to step back from the door and open it wider and say, "Come in." And the two words were simple, and they were immediate, and they did not have any of the qualifications or conditions that she had been bracing for without knowing she was bracing. And she stepped inside, because the inside was where the help was, if help was going to come from this place. And she had come to this place for help, and the door was open, and so she went in. The house was large in the way that she had imagined a house like this would be large, but the largeness was not the thing she registered most immediately. What she registered most immediately was the quiet of it. The particular morning quiet of a large house that was not yet fully in its working day. And Harrison was already moving toward the kitchen, and she followed him. Because following seemed like the right response to come in, and he went to the kitchen and he pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, and he gestured to it, and she sat down. And he did not remain standing the way she had half expected. He pulled out the chair on the other side of the table, and he sat down too. And this sitting down across from her was the thing that did something to the quality of the next hour that might not have been done if he had stayed standing. Because a person standing across from you while you were sitting was a different conversation from a person sitting across from you at the same table. And she did not analyze this in the moment, but she felt it, felt the difference it made. And she told him everything she had told the woman on the phone and the neighbor and the police officer, and she told it the same way she had told it each time, which was plainly and in order. Because plain and in order was all she had, and she was not going to dress it up or make it smaller or manage his response to it by editing the parts that were frightening. She was going to say the full thing and let it be the full thing and see what he did with it. He listened without interrupting, which was the first thing. And the listening had a quality to it that was different from the careful, measured listening of the police officer, which had been thorough and professional and had felt slightly like being processed. This listening felt like being heard, which was a different thing, and she felt the difference even in the state she was in. Even with the cup on the drying rack and the maid bed and the voicemail all still pressing on her from the inside. When she finished, he asked her questions, and the questions were the questions of a mind that was actually working on the problem, rather than covering the ground that politeness required. He asked about the route her mother usually walked, and whether she always walked or sometimes took the bus, and whether the bus route had changed recently, and whether she had ever mentioned anything about the walk, any part of it that she found difficult or any place she stopped, and whether her health had been any different recently, and whether there was anyone else in her life who might know something that Brianna did not know. And Brianna answered each question as completely as she could, and the answering felt useful in a way that the phone call to the police had not quite felt useful. Because the police's protocol was designed to gather information, and Harrison's questions were designed to find someone. And the difference between those two orientations was something she could feel in the way the questions arrived, and the way they built on each other, and the way he was listening to her answers and doing something with them, rather than recording them. After the questions, he picked up his phone from the table, and he made the first call, and Brianna sat across from him, and she heard the way the call was received on the other end. The immediate quality of the attention that came through, even from her side of the conversation. And she heard him give the information she had given him in the same plain order she had given it, but with a specificity and a direction. In his voice that she understood was the voice of someone who was accustomed to calls being answered and actions being taken, and who carried that expectation so completely that it communicated itself through the phone without needing to be stated explicitly. And the call ended, and he made another, and then another, and between the calls he looked up at her and he said they were going to find her, and he said it in the tone of a man saying something he intended to make true rather than something he was offering as comfort. And there was a difference between those two things that she felt clearly, and that made her breathe for the first time since 6/17, in a way that was slightly less compressed than the breathing she had been doing since then. Not relieved, not yet anywhere near relieved, but slightly less compressed. The breathing of someone who has put down one small part of a very heavy thing without putting down the heavy thing itself. He got up from the table and he went to the counter and he poured a glass of water and he set it in front of her, and she realized she had not had anything since the night before. And she drank half of it, and he sat back down and he was on the phone again, and she sat across from him in the kitchen of the Whitfield estate in the February morning, and she looked at the table and she looked at her hands, and she thought about the cup on the drying rack in their apartment, and she thought about her mother making the bed before a shift and the hand on the bedroom door at 6:25 every morning, and she held those things in her mind the way you held the things that were most essentially true about a person when the person was not where they were supposed to be. Held them like evidence of something, like the clearest argument available for why the person had to be found. And across the table from Harrison, Whitfield was making his fourth call, and his fifth, and the February light was coming through the kitchen window in the slow way of February light, and the house was beginning to come to life around them in its working day way, and neither of them remarked on any of it. And the water glass was in front of her, and she drank the rest of it, and she waited in the only way she knew how to wait, which was by staying present in the moment she was in and not moving into the moments that had not happened yet, because the moments that had not happened yet were too large to be in before they arrived. Nobody came looking for Grace Osei. That was the part that broke Amara the most. Not the fear, not the sleepless nights, not even the cold way the police officer had slid a form across the desk without looking up at her. It was the silence, the complete and total silence from people who were supposed to care. She had walked into that police station with her mother's photograph, a woman who had worked hard her entire life, who had never missed a shift, never caused trouble, never given anyone a reason to doubt her character. And the man behind the desk had looked at the picture for maybe 2 seconds before setting it face down on a pile of other papers. Face down, like her mother was already a closed case before anyone had even opened one. Amara stood there for a moment, waiting for something, some sense that this man understood what she was telling him, but he just asked her to spell her last name and moved on. She walked out of that station into the cold morning air and stood on the pavement and breathed slowly, because if she didn't breathe slowly, she was going to fall apart right there on the street. And she could not afford to fall apart. Not yet. Not while her mother was still out there somewhere. She went home that night and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The house felt wrong without her mother in it. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you hear things that aren't there. She kept thinking she heard footsteps on the front path. Kept thinking she heard the familiar sound of her mother's key in the lock. But every time she looked up, there was nothing. Just the dark hallway and the door that didn't open. She made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink and thought about what she knew. Her mother had clocked out. She had left the estate. Something had happened between the gate and home, somewhere in that stretch of road and darkness that nobody was bothering to investigate. And if nobody was going to look, then she was going to look herself. She didn't know exactly what she was doing or what she was looking for. She just knew she had to move, because sitting still felt like giving up, and giving up was something she refused to do. The next morning, she retraced her mother's route on foot. It wasn't a short walk. Her mother had always taken the late bus from the stop near the bottom of the hill, then walked the remaining stretch home to save money. Amara walked that same path slowly, looking at the ground, looking at the edges of the road, looking at everything her mother would have seen in the dark. It was an ordinary route. Quiet roads, a few street lights, a stretch where the lighting disappeared completely for about half a mile, and then the turn toward their neighborhood. She walked it twice. On the second time, when she was moving slower, not because she had found anything, but because her legs were tired and her heart was heavier than she could explain, she noticed something in the dirt near a rusted drainage grate at the side of the road. She almost walked past it. She would have walked past it, except that something made her stop and crouch down, some small instinct she couldn't name, and when she looked closely, she saw it. A small laminated card, half covered in mud, the corner of it catching just enough of the pale morning light that it was visible. She picked it up carefully and wiped the mud away with the edge of her sleeve, and her hands were shaking before she even saw the full picture, because something in her already knew. It was her mother's work identification card, the one Grace kept clipped to the front pocket of her uniform every single night. Amara sat down on the pavement right there. Just sat down, right in the middle of that cold, empty road, and held the card with both hands and stared at her mother's face looking back at her. That photograph had been taken 3 years ago. Her mother was smiling in it, the way she always smiled. Not a big flashy smile, but a warm, quiet one. The kind of smile that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. Amara pressed the card against her chest and closed her eyes and told herself not to cry. Not here, not now, because if she started, she wouldn't stop. She breathed. She stood up. She looked around at the road around her, at where exactly she was standing, and she made a note of it in her phone. Then she looked ahead, past the drainage grate, further down the road to where it curved, and she noticed for the first time that further along, set back from the road behind overgrown hedges, there was a building. Large and gray and clearly unused. The windows were boarded. The gates at the front were chained shut. She had walked this road her whole life and had never really looked at that building before, because there was nothing about it that invited looking. It was the kind of place your eyes just slid past. But now she was looking. She didn't go near it that morning. She went instead to the estate and asked to see the man who had first listened to her. She sat across from him at the large kitchen table, in the same house her mother had cleaned for over a decade, and she placed her mother's identification card on the table between them and told him exactly where she had found it and exactly what she had seen. He looked at the card for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, in the way that the police officer had not, and she could see something shifting in his expression. Not pity. Something closer to shame, because he was starting to understand what she had understood from the beginning, that the people who should have been doing this, betraying people with the resources and the authority, hadn't done it. A 17-year-old girl had walked her mother's route alone in the cold and found the one piece of evidence that mattered, and she had done it because nobody else was going to. He made some calls that afternoon. A private investigator who had worked for the family before was contacted and brought in quickly. But even as those conversations were happening, it was Amara's information that was driving everything. She had given them the location. She had given them the card. She had given them the direction. The investigator listened to her carefully, asked her to describe the building again, asked about the chain gate and the board windows and the position of the road. And then he pulled up a map on his phone and they all looked at it together. The building was registered as a disused storage warehouse. It had been empty for years, at least officially. It sat less than 2 miles from the estate in a direction that most people had no reason to travel after dark. Amara looked at that map and felt something move through her that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't hope exactly. It was more like a door opening in a room that had been sealed shut. She had walked that road. She had found that card. She had come here and laid everything out on the table in front of someone who finally was taking her seriously. She didn't know yet what was behind those boarded windows. She didn't know yet whether her mother was safe or whether she was going to have to survive, something that no teenager should ever have to survive. But she knew that the silence was over. The days of being looked through, talked past, handed forms without eye contact, those days were done. She had gone looking when no one else would, and she had found something real. And now the truth, whatever it was, wherever it led, was going to have to come out. She sat back in that chair and breathed and held her mother's photograph in her hand and waited for what came next. She had gotten this far on nothing but love and stubbornness. She wasn't stopping now.